We've looked at the myths surrounding carbon fibre. We've lifted the lid on aluminium. We've investigated whether steel is in fact real. It was. But there is still a big gap in the GCN Material Sciences course, and that is titanium. For a while in the early 90s, titanium was going to be the next big thing. And to be fair, it briefly was, but little by little it became eclipsed by carbon fibre. Nevertheless though, it still has a legion of super loyal fans, and quite right too. So if you're not on board the titanium train yet, or perhaps more accurately, military aircraft or submarine, what do you need to know? Despite having the reputation that it's the preserve of the Russian or American military, which to be fair, it kind of was, titanium is actually the 9th most common element in the Earth's crust. And as well as using it to make bikes, you can also find it in sun cream and paper to make it whiter. Clearly though, what makes paper white doesn't really help very much when you're making bikes, other than perhaps drawing up your initial ideas. And that is because it's titanium oxide that's used in paper, whereas when we're making bikes, we need a titanium alloy. The very first titanium bikes were actually though made out of pure titanium, but they're very flexible and they weren't very much good. And it wasn't until a titanium alloy called 3Al/2.5V that changed, having blended in 3% aluminium and 2.5% vanadium. The other common titanium alloy for bikes is 6Al/4V. Both have a very high Young's modulus, which is a measure of the stiffness of the material. So they have a GPa of about 110, as opposed to, let's say, 6061 aluminium, which has a GPa of about 69. And they also have a much higher yield strength. So that is the point at which a material stops returning to its original position when a stress is removed. So 6,4 titanium has an MPa of 1000, whereas again 6061 aluminium has an MPa of just 270. And what that means is that the material won't deform or bend or buckle in a crash. 325 actually has a lower yield strength than 6,4 titanium, but then that's one of the reasons why it is used almost exclusively in bike building, because 6,4 titanium is incredibly hard to work with. It's more brittle and less ductile, so forming it into simple shapes, like, I don't know, tubes for a start, is incredibly hard. And actually most 6,4 titanium tubes are rolled from sheet metal and then welded, whereas 325 tends to be seamless. And so that actually gives a more consistent overall tube, and therefore it's better from a quality control perspective. So in other words, basically, although on paper the material properties of 6,4 titanium might look better, it won't necessarily yield a better bike. Titanium is renowned as being super light, but in fact, as a material, it's actually 60% denser than aluminium. However, given what we've just heard about the other material properties, you can still see why titanium frames tend to come out slightly lighter than aluminium ones. So the best examples of each would be about 1,000 grams for a titanium frame and about 1,100 grams for aluminium. So 100 grams in it. And the reason that difference is actually still quite small is probably down to a measure of just how much easier it is to work and manipulate aluminium. And we'll come on to that a little bit later on. And we also have to bear in mind that super light titanium frames will also have exceedingly thin walled tubing as a result of that extra density. And then when we compare it to steel, titanium is as strong but 45% less dense. And so that explains why titanium frames are significantly lighter than steel ones. That toughness in terms of material properties does make titanium very difficult to work with, as we've already touched on. Fortunately though, much of that difficulty is actually dealt with by the tube manufacturers themselves. One of those things is that internally butted tubes can't be made safely from titanium. Basically, the danger is that titanium can be overworked, and then that would lead to weakness in the material. Now, on the flip side, what you can do is externally butt the tubing. So instead of a mandrel working away inside the tube, titanium is shaved off from the outside. However, that does rely heavily on the straightness of the tubing in the first place, because any imperfections in that would also then be reflected in the wall thicknesses. So that's probably why this bike behind me is made out of straight gauge titanium tubing. Titanium is also a little bit trickier to weld than steel or aluminium, and that's because it's reactive to oxygen at higher temperatures, meaning that when it is welded, it needs to be done in an absence of that gas. Now, to be fair, all metals need to be welded in an inert gas environment, but titanium is particularly sensitive. So to put it in context, if you're welding steel, an acceptable purge, so-called, needs to be about 1,000 parts of oxygen per million, whereas with titanium, it's just 10 parts per million. So that is a little bit of a challenge to a welder. And if any oxygen does get into the weld, then the titanium oxidizes, which, if you remember from earlier in the video, is a very white, almost worthless white powder. And so the technique then is to weld in an inert argon atmosphere. So basically you pipe argon gas into the tubes and then externally to the weld as well, but then that ensures that it's all nice and strong. The last thing that can make titanium a bit tricky is working. So you see, we mentioned earlier that aluminium can be engineered and manipulated into all sorts of complicated shapes. But with titanium, even bending a simple S-bend chainstay, for example, extreme care has to be taken that you don't overwork the material, which can then lead to it becoming brittle and therefore weak. So in order to avoid that, the titanium needs to be annealed, which is where you heat it up and then you allow it to cool down slowly in between each incremental step of the process. It's quite time consuming, labor intensive, and it's another reason why titanium bikes tend to be quite expensive. Is it expensive though? Well, yes, compared to aluminium bikes, but it's probably on a par with custom steel and significantly cheaper, you've got to say, than top-end carbon fiber. It is a boutique material, and so yes, there is a boutique cost as well. So the raw material is between $10 and $12 per kilo. Finished tubes are between $100 to $120 per kilo, but that puts it a little bit more than standard steel and on a par with stainless steel. But dare I say it though, because it's not quite so fashionable at the moment, perhaps, in the cycling world, there are some relative bargains to be had. And to be fair, we've given you an awful lot of information so far, but we've not quite got to the nub yet of why titanium has such a loyal following and can be, frankly, so great. You can get a custom titanium frame really quite easily, and it's going to be considerably lighter than an equivalent custom steel frame. So about 400 grams lighter. I'd guess average custom steel frame is about 1,600 grams. Titanium could be about 1,200 grams, which is pretty important if you are looking to build a super light road bike. Yes, titanium is reactive, but your frame is not going to corrode. Not like steel, not like aluminium, it is going to last. And so for many people, the tie bike is the keeper. Beauty is very much in the eye of the beholder, but I think titanium has undeniably a special something. I mean, look at the raw finish on this. It's like it's glowing. The ride quality, even harder to pin down than aesthetics. Now, traditionally, titanium has a ride feel like no other, but the boundaries between materials are blurring. Engineering is taking things to new places. So steel can now be as stiff as aluminium. Aluminium can now be as forgiving as carbon fiber. But titanium traditionally has always been about zing. I heard it described back in the day like a great titanium frame was trying to spring forward and gain momentum off every bump or ripple in the road. And that, to my mind, sounds pretty amazing. Unfortunately, I've literally never spent any proper time on a titanium bike. So at some point soon, I hope to remedy that. Well, there is your titanium 101. Hopefully you can add it now as a material that you know as much about as steel, aluminium, and carbon fiber. Please give this video a big thumbs up. If nothing else, you've been looking at some bike porn for the last few minutes. And if you want to watch one of those videos, refresh your knowledge about the other materials, why not check out the one about aluminium just down there.